Mara wiped down the long wooden bar with the same slow, steady strokes she had used every evening for the past 3 years. The cloth moved in circles. Her eyes moved with it. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountain ridge, pushing cold air through the gaps in the tavern walls and making the hanging lanterns sway just enough to shift the shadows across the floor. The Ember's Rest was not a beautiful place. The ceiling was low and dark with old smoke. The tables were thick and scarred from years of heavy use. The chairs did not match. The floor had been swept so many times that the wood had gone pale in the middle and stayed dark only near the walls where the broom never quite reached. It smelled like roasted meat, pine smoke, and the sharp tang of the local brew that the regulars drank in silence because talking too much in a frontier town had a way of inviting trouble. The regulars were mostly humans. Miners from the ridgeline camps. A few traders who moved goods between the settlements. 2 old farmers who came in every evening not because they were thirsty but because their houses were quiet and the tavern was not. They sat in their usual spots and they watched the door the way people in frontier towns always watched the door. The door opened. It did not open the way a human opens a door. It opened the way something very large and very old opens a door, slowly, with a kind of controlled patience that made it clear the thing on the other side could have taken the door off its frame without noticing. The frame itself groaned. The lantern swayed harder. 3 dragons stepped inside. They were not young. That was the first thing anyone in the tavern understood, even before they had time to be afraid. Young dragons were loud and bright and careless with their size. These 3 were none of those things. They moved like soldiers who had learned long ago that stillness was more dangerous than noise. Their scales were dull in the way old armor is dull, not from neglect, but from use. There were marks on them that did not come from accidents. Long pale lines across old dark scales. The kind of marks that only came from other dragons. The biggest one, gray along the jaw and shoulders, paused just inside the doorway and looked at the room. Every human in the tavern found something very interesting to look at that was not the dragons. The 2 old farmers studied their cups. The miners examined the table in front of them with great focus. The traders became suddenly very busy with a conversation that had no words. Mara looked up from the bar. She looked at the 3 veterans the way she looked at everything in the tavern. With calm, steady attention. Not the kind of calm that comes from not understanding a situation. The kind that comes from having already decided, somewhere quiet inside yourself, that the situation was manageable. She set down her cloth. She picked up 3 of the largest cups from the shelf behind her and walked out from behind the bar without hurrying. The gray one watched her come. She stopped at the table they had taken near the back wall, the table with the most space around it, which they had chosen without discussion, and she set the cups down in front of them one at a time. "Anything hot?" the gray one said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had given orders so many times it had stopped needing volume to carry weight. He spoke in the common tongue, but with the flat precision of someone for whom it was not a first language. "Meat broth," Mara said. "I have bread that is fresh from this morning. I have a stew with root vegetables and whatever came off the ridge today. I have roasted grain mash if you want something heavier." "All of it," the gray one said. She nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. "One of the other 2. The one with the scar that ran from her left eye down across her jaw like a river on a map, spoke without looking at Mara. "Human," she said. Mara stopped and turned. "You are not afraid," the scarred one said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that carries a test inside it. "No," Mara said. "Why not?" Mara considered this for a moment with the same unhurried expression she wore when someone asked her what was in the stew. "Because being afraid of you will not change anything about you," she said. "And it will make me spill the broth." The scarred one looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, and something in the set of her shoulders shifted in a way that was very small and very hard to name. Mara went to the kitchen. The regulars breathed. She came back 3 times with food. The bread first. Then the broth, which she set down in front of each of them with the same steady hands, not rushing, not performing confidence for anyone watching. Just working. The stew came last, in a pot she carried with both hands because of its weight, and she set it in the center of the table without ceremony. The 3 veterans ate in silence. They did not speak to each other or to anyone in the room. The big gray one ate methodically. The scarred one ate quickly, the way someone eats when they have learned not to trust that the meal will last. The third one, older than the other 2, with scales so dark they looked almost black and eyes that had gone pale with age, barely ate at all. He sat with his cup and looked at the fire. Mara came back to collect the bread plate. She reached across the table, and as she did, the sleeve of her shirt slid back along her left arm. It was a small thing. A few inches of skin. But the old dark-scaled one, who had been staring at the fire and seemed to have no attention left for anything else in the room, turned his head. He looked at her wrist. Mara pulled the plate off the table and straightened up without noticing his attention. The old one did not look away. His pale eyes moved from her wrist to her face and then to the wrist again, slow and careful, the way a soldier looks at something he recognizes in a place where it should not be. On the inside of Mara's wrist, faded to the color of old ash against her skin, was a burn mark. Not a scar from an accident. Not the shapeless mark of careless fire. It was deliberate. It had been made by something precise, and it held its pattern still, after years, the way certain things hold their shape because they were made to last. The shape was not human. It was a flame mark. The kind pressed into the scales of a newborn dragon by a parent's claw tip in the first hour of life. The kind that meant, this one is mine, and I will burn the world before I let it be taken. The old one set down his cup very quietly. He looked at the gray one across the table. The gray one had already seen it. Scareth did not ask immediately. That was the thing about old soldiers. They did not move fast toward anything anymore. Not because they were slow. But because they had learned, over many years and many bad situations, that the first move was rarely the right one. So he sat with what he had seen, and he turned it over quietly in his mind the way a stone gets turned over to see what lives underneath, and he watched Mara move through the rest of her evening work. She refilled cups. She carried plates. She exchanged short words with the miners at the front table about whether the weather would close the ridge road before the end of the week. She wiped down the bar again. She did all of this the same way she had done everything else since they arrived, without performance, without hurry, without any sign that she knew she was being watched by 3 pairs of very old and very experienced eyes. The regulars had relaxed somewhat. Not completely. People in frontier towns never fully relaxed when dragons were present, the same way you never fully relax standing near a fire, even a controlled one. But the 3 veterans had eaten and sat quietly and had not broken anything, and the evening had moved forward, and the farmers had gone back to talking about their fields in low voices, and the miners had gone back to their cards. The tavern breathed again. Scareth waited until Mara came back to the large table to collect the stew pot. She reached for the handle with both hands, the same as before, and as she did, her left sleeve fell back again along her arm. She had not fixed it. She did not seem to think about it as something that needed fixing. The mark sat on the inside of her wrist, visible and plain, and she picked up the pot and started to straighten. Scareth spoke. He did not speak in the common tongue. He spoke in Draconic. Not the simple trading Draconic that some humans along the frontier had picked up, a flat, basic form of the language built for commerce, stripped of all its shape and weight. He spoke in full Draconic, the real form of it, low and resonant, with the particular cadence of a question asked seriously. He said, "Where did you come by that mark?" He expected one of several things. He expected her to look up with blank eyes, the way people looked when they heard a sound they did not recognize as language. He expected confusion, or the small embarrassed smile of someone who had heard something they could not follow. He expected her to say pardon, or to ask if he wanted something more from the kitchen. He did not expect what happened. Mara paused. Not the pause of confusion. The pause of someone choosing their words. She answered in Draconic. Not trading Draconic. Not the simple frontier version with its clipped sounds and missing tones. She answered in the old dialect. The clan dialect. The form of Draconic that had not been spoken widely in over 2 generations, that required growing up inside it to carry properly, that had sounds in it that human mouths were generally not built to shape without years of practice from a very young age. She did not look up from the stew pot as she spoke. She said, "It was my mother's, given through the laying of a hand in fire." Then she picked up the pot and walked back toward the kitchen. The tavern continued around them. The lanterns swayed. The fire crackled. The farmers talked about rain. At the large table near the back wall, 3 veteran dragons sat completely still. Valindra, the scarred one, had gone rigid in the particular way of someone who has just heard something that does not fit inside the shape of the world as they understand it. Her cup was halfway to her mouth and it stayed there, suspended, because the signal to complete the motion had not arrived. Bryn Cole, the oldest, the dark-scaled one with the pale eyes, had closed those eyes. He was not sleeping. His expression was not peaceful. It was the expression of someone doing the hard internal work of taking a new piece of information and finding a place to put it among everything else they knew. Scareth sat with both hands flat on the table and said nothing. The laying of a hand in fire was not a human right. It was not even a common dragon right. It was old. It was clan old, which meant older than the current borders, older than the war treaties, older than most of the settlements on this side of the mountain. It came from a time when dragon clans were still small enough that every life in them mattered individually, and the way you marked that a life mattered was not with words, which could be said without cost, but with fire, which could not. The parent pressed their hand into open flame and held it there, and the child's hand was placed against the parent's palm, and the mark passed from one to the other in the heat. It left a burn on both of them. The parent carried the mark of giving. The child carried the mark of being chosen. It was not symbolic. It was not decorative. It was a contract made in pain, in front of whatever witness the fire itself counted as, and it meant one specific thing in the language of the clans that had practiced it. It meant, "I will die before I let harm come to this one." It could not be faked because the mark itself was the proof. The shape was too precise to be imitated by accident or by any ordinary burn. Any dragon who had grown up inside clan culture could look at it and know immediately what it was and how it had been made. There was no other explanation for that particular mark in that particular place on a living body. Which meant Mara's mother had made it. Which meant Mara's mother had held her hand in fire and placed her child's hand against her own burning palm and accepted the mark of giving onto her own skin. Which meant Mara's mother had been willing to die for her. Scareth looked at Valindra. Valindra lowered her cup slowly. Her scar pulled at the corner of her eye the way it always did when her jaw was tight. Bryn Cole opened his eyes and looked at the kitchen door where Mara had gone. There was a question that needed asking and all 3 of them knew what it was. It was not a small question. It was the kind of question that, once asked and answered, changed the shape of the evening and possibly several other things besides. They had all 3 lived long enough to recognize that kind of question before it was spoken. Mara came back out of the kitchen with a dry cloth over her shoulder and started on the next table. Valindra watched her for a moment. She watched the way she moved, the set of her shoulders, the calm in her hands. She thought about the clan dialect spoken without hesitation by a human woman in a frontier tavern who had not looked up from what she was doing. Valindra set her cup down on the table with a sound that was very quiet and very final. She looked at Mara across the room. "Girl," she said. In Draconic. In the old dialect. Mara looked up. "Who was your mother?" Mara looked at Valindra for a moment. Not the way someone looks when they are deciding whether to answer. The way someone looks when they are deciding how much of the answer to give. There is a difference, and Valindra had spent enough years watching people under pressure to know which one she was seeing. The tavern had gone quiet again. Not the loud quiet of earlier, when the three veterans had first walked in and every human in the room had gone stiff with fear. This was a softer quiet. The kind that happens when people are not sure what they are watching but can feel that it matters. The farmers had stopped talking. The miners had put down their cards. The innkeeper stood in the doorway to the back room with a drying cloth in both hands and did not move. Mara set down the cloth she had been using on the table beside her. She did not sit. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and she looked at Valindra with those steady eyes, and then she said the name. Drentha, she said. Of the Ember Crest clan. She said it in the common tongue, not draconic. Simply. Without decoration. The way you say a name that you have carried for a long time and learned to carry quietly. The silence that followed was not like the silence before it. The silence before had been the absence of noise. This silence was a different thing entirely. It was the silence of three very old and very battle-hardened creatures being hit somewhere they had not expected to be hit. It had weight to it. It pressed against the walls of the room and against the smoke-dark ceiling and against the chests of the few humans present who did not even understand what they were feeling but felt it anyway, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Valindra did not move. Scaratha's hands, which had been flat and still on the table since he first heard Mara speak Draconic, curled very slowly. Not in anger. The way hands curl when the body needs to hold on to something and there is nothing to hold. Bryn Cole made a sound. It was not a word. It was not quite a sound that could be written down or described properly in any human language. It was the sound of something very old breaking open just slightly, the way old wood sounds when it finally gives under a weight it has been holding for too long. He made that sound once, very quietly, and then he lifted his great dark wing and folded it forward and covered his face with it, and he sat like that, still as stone, with his face hidden and the pale edges of his old scales catching the firelight. Nobody in the tavern said anything. Mara watched them. She had expected recognition. She had carried that name long enough to understand that it meant something in the world beyond her own life. The traveling scholar who had told her about the flame mark had gone very still when she mentioned her mother's name, and had asked her twice to repeat it, and had then sat across from her at a roadside table for 2 full hours asking careful questions. She knew the name carried weight. She had not expected this. She had not expected the grey veteran's hands to curl. She had not expected the scarred one to stop breathing for a moment in a way that was visible even across the room. She had not expected Bryn Cole, who had the look of someone who had seen everything the world had to offer and had stopped being surprised by any of it, to cover his face. Scareth spoke first. His voice had changed. It was still low and even, but something underneath it had shifted, the way the ground shifts very slightly before it shows a crack. "You are certain of that name," he said. "In Draconic. The old dialect." "Yes," Mara said. "Drentha of the Ember Crest," he said again, as if saying it a second time would make it fit differently in the space around them. "Yes," Mara said again. "She was my mother." Scareth looked at Valindra. Valindra was looking at Mara with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more complicated. Her scar ran down the left side of her face in that long pale line, and the muscle beneath it was tight, and her eyes were doing the work of someone trying to build a complete picture out of pieces they had not known they were missing. "Drentha had no child," Valindra said. Not harshly. Like a fact she was checking against a new fact. "She had me," Mara said. There was no argument in it. Just the plain statement of someone who knew what they knew. "We did not know," Valindra said. "No," Mara said. "I do not think she told anyone." Bryn Cole lowered his wing. His face, when it came back into the light, was composed. The long years showed in it more than they had before, the way age sometimes becomes more visible after a hard moment, as if something that had been holding the years back had let go. His pale eyes found Mara and stayed on her, moving over her face with the slow attention of someone reading something written in a language they had not seen for a very long time. "I was at the southern pass," he said. His voice was rough, not from harshness but from something else entirely. "I was there for the first day before they pulled us back." She was already holding it when we arrived and she was still holding it when they ordered the retreat. Mara was quiet. 3 days, Bryn Cole said. She held that pass for 3 days. Alone. So that the rest of us could get the wounded out. So that the human columns could clear the valley road. He paused. We did not know if she was alive until the 4th day. When she came down off the ridge herself. Mara looked at the fire. Something moved across her face, quick and private, and then it was gone and she was composed again. But it had been there. The look of someone hearing a story about a person they loved, told by someone who was there, and finding out that the story was even larger than they had known. She never told me that, Mara said. Quietly. She would not have, Scareth said. That was her way. The room was very still. The fire had burned lower without anyone noticing. The farmers were sitting with their hands around their cups and their eyes down, not from disinterest but from the instinct of decent people who understand when something private is happening nearby and do not want to intrude on it. Mara stood in the middle of the room, between the tables, with the cloth still sitting on the table where she had left it, and she looked at the 3 veterans, and they looked at her. She had her mother's calm. That was what Bryn Cole was seeing, and he knew it, and it was the most difficult thing in the room to look at and the only thing he could not look away from. Outside the wind pushed hard against the walls of the tavern. Inside nobody moved. The tavern emptied slowly. Not because anyone asked it to. Nobody stood up and told the farmers to go home or the miners to finish their cards and leave. It happened the way certain things happen in small communities where people have spent enough years together to read a situation without being told what it means. One of the farmers drained his cup and stood up and put on his coat and nodded at nobody in particular on his way out. The other one followed a minute later. The miners gathered their cards without counting the pot and filed out in a quiet line. The innkeeper set the drying cloth on the bar, looked at Mara once with an expression that asked a silent question, and Mara gave him a small nod that answered it, and he went through the back door and pulled it nearly shut behind him. The lanterns burned on. The fire had been fed at some point without anyone marking exactly when, and it was steady now, pushing warm light out across the empty tables and the mismatched chairs and the pale middle of the swept floor. Mara stood where she had been standing. Scareth moved first. He shifted his weight and folded his front legs and lowered himself down, not to the floor entirely, but low enough that the distance between his eyes and Mara's eyes was no longer the distance between a very large creature and a small one. It was deliberate. It was the kind of movement that cost something in pride for a creature that size, and he made it without hesitation, and the meaning of it was plain. Valindra did the same, settling on the other side of the table, her scarred face now level and close, the firelight catching the pale line running from her eye to her jaw. Bryn Cole lowered himself last, the oldest and the slowest, his dark scales catching the warmth of the fire and holding it. He arranged himself with care and then he was still, his pale eyes on Mara, and the 3 of them formed a kind of loose circle around her in the empty room. Mara pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat in it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Not from awkwardness. From the particular quiet that settles before something real is said, when everyone present knows that what comes next will matter and is taking a breath before it begins. Bryn Cole spoke first. She sang, he said. Mara looked at him. Before every engagement, he said. Every time. It did not matter how large or how small. Before a patrol and before a full battle, she sang. He paused. She sang very badly. Something shifted in Mara's expression. A small thing, at the corner of her mouth. On purpose, Valindra said, and there was something in her voice that was almost warm, the way old pain becomes almost warm when enough time has passed and the right person is listening. We asked her once. She said fear could not share a body with an embarrassing song. If you were busy being embarrassed, you were not busy being afraid. Valindra looked at the fire. It worked. Even when we did not want it to work. You cannot maintain proper fear when the commander is singing completely wrong notes at full volume before dawn. Mara made a sound. It was short and quiet, and it was the first time since the 3 veterans had arrived that anything like it had come from her. Not quite a laugh. The shape of one. She hummed, Mara said. When I was small. In the mornings. Always wrong. Bryn Cole looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. That sounds right. Scareth shifted slightly. There was something else, he said. Something none of us understood at the time. He looked at Bryn Cole, and Bryn Cole looked back, and the look between them was the look of 2 people confirming that the other remembers the same thing. She kept something in her chest armor. Throughout the entire war. Every march, every engagement, every field camp in the rain. She kept it in the inner panel, behind the left plate. Mara was very still. We saw it once, Valindra said. When she was having the armor repaired after the 3rd Valley engagement. The armorer took the plate off and it was there, sitting in the hollow. A small carved figure. Stone. The shape of something sleeping. She paused. We asked her what it was. She put it in her hand and closed her fist around it and said it was nothing important. Valindra's voice was dry. She said it in the tone she used when something was very important. Mara's right hand had moved to her chest without her seeming to notice it. Her fingers had found something beneath the fabric of her shirt, something on a cord around her neck, and they were holding it. Scareth watched her hand. We never knew what it was, he said. We never asked again because she was Drentha, and you learned quickly which questions she would answer and which ones she had already decided were finished. A pause. It stayed in that armor for 4 years. Mara's hand did not move. The fire crackled once. Bryn Cole said, very quietly, what is on that cord, child? Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she reached up and lifted the cord over her head and held it in her open palm in the space between herself and the 3 veterans. It was a small carved figure. Stone, pale gray, worn smooth from years of being held. It was the shape of a sleeping dragon, curled tight, the tail wrapped around the body, the head tucked down. The carving was simple, but it had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. Every line was clean. It had the particular quality of something that had been looked at and touched so many times over so many years that it had taken on a kind of warmth that stone does not naturally have. But that was not the thing that stopped the breath in the room. The thing was this: along the flat base of the figure, where the stone had been cut level, there was an edge. Not a natural edge. A deliberate one. The figure had been cut in half at some point, cleanly, and this was one piece of 2. Valindra leaned forward. Scareth did not move, but his eyes were fixed on the carving with an intensity that had not been in them since he first saw the flame mark. Bryn Cole looked at the flat-cut edge of the stone figure in Mara's palm, and he breathed out, slowly, through his nose, and the breath shook just slightly at the end of it. She had the other half, Mara said. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone working to keep it that way. She put it around my neck the last morning. She said, keep this and do not lose it. A pause. I was 4 years old. I did not understand what she was telling me. Nobody said anything. Mara closed her fingers around the small carved figure and held it the way her mother had held it, fist closed, in the palm of her hand. Outside the wind moved through the dark and the fire burned low and steady, and the empty tavern held all of it without complaint. Bryn Cole was the one who said it. He had been sitting quietly for a long time after Mara closed her hand around the carved figure. Long enough that the fire had shifted and the light in the room had changed slightly and the shadows had moved. He sat with his pale eyes looking at something that was not in the room, the way very old people sometimes look when they are moving through memories rather than through the present moment, and nobody disturbed him. Then he came back. He looked at Mara's left wrist. The mark was never witnessed, he said. It was not a question. It was said in the quiet tone of someone who has just understood something that had been sitting in front of them for a while, the way you finally see the shape hidden in a complicated drawing and wonder how you missed it. Valindra looked at him. She was alone when she made it, Brincole said. Drentha. She would have been alone. She would not have told anyone she had a child, and she would not have brought witnesses, and she would have done it by herself in whatever place she had kept the girl hidden. He paused. Which means the ceremony was never completed. The room was very still. Mara looked between them. She knew enough of the old clan customs by now, pieced together from the scholar's careful explanations and from years of carrying something on her wrist that she had slowly learned to understand, to follow what he was saying. But she did not speak. She waited. Scareth straightened slightly. Something had come into his bearing that had not been there a moment before. Not stiffness. Purpose. The way a soldier looks when a situation that has been unclear suddenly becomes clear and there is something specific to be done. By old law, he said, a flame mark given without witnesses is a mark given in love but not in record. The child carries the feeling of it but not the full weight of it. It is not complete until warriors of the clan have seen it and spoken the name. He looked at Mara steadily. Until that is done, the child stands outside the protection of the clan's name. Drentha's clan is gone, Valindra said. Not as an objection. As a fact being laid on the table to be examined. Yes, Scareth said. The Ember Crest is gone. Scattered or dead. There is no clan to stand witness in the formal way. He was quiet for a moment. But the law does not say clan members only. It says warriors who knew the one who gave the mark. Warriors who can speak to who she was. He looked at Brincole. Then at Valindra. Then back at Mara. We are 3. The minimum is 3. Mara sat very still in her chair. She understood what he was saying. She understood it in the way you understand something that is both completely unexpected and somehow exactly right, the way a door opens onto a room you did not know was there but that feels, the moment you see it, like it was always meant to be. You do not have to accept it, Valindra said. Her voice was careful. It is your choice. It has always been your choice. The mark is yours and what you do with it is yours. Mara looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at the 3 of them, these old tired veterans with their scarred scales and their pale eyes and their long memories, who had walked into a frontier tavern and eaten stew and changed the entire shape of her life in the space of one evening. Tell me what to do, she said. Scareth nodded once. Give me your wrist, he said. Mara stood up from the chair and stepped closer to the fire and held out her left arm with the inside of her wrist facing up. The flame mark sat there in the firelight, faded and old and patient, the way certain things are patient because they have been waiting a long time for something and have learned how to wait. Scareth pressed his thumb to the mark. His thumb was enormous against her small wrist. The edge of it covered the mark entirely. He held it there and he turned his head toward the fire, toward the actual flames in the hearth, and he spoke. He spoke in the old dialect. The clan dialect. He spoke Mara's full name, all 3 words of it, clearly and without rushing, and then he spoke her mother's name after it, and then he spoke the words of the witnessing, the old formal words that had not been said in this combination in longer than Mara had been alive, and his voice was low and steady and it carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and was doing it with their full attention. He lifted his thumb. Valindra moved forward. She pressed her thumb to the mark and turned to the fire and she spoke. Her voice was different from Scaretha's, rougher at the edges, with the particular roughness of someone who did not often let their voice carry feeling and was letting it now. She said Mara's name. She said Drentha's name. She said the words. She held her thumb there for a moment after she finished, just a breath longer than necessary, and then she stepped back. Bryn Cole was last. He moved slowly. He was always slow now, the age in his joints showing in the careful way he placed each step. He came to stand before Mara and he looked at her face for a moment before he looked at her wrist, and what was in his expression was not simple to describe. It was grief and recognition and something that was almost relief, the relief of someone who has been carrying an unfinished thing for a very long time and can finally see the end of it. He pressed his thumb to the flame mark. And he spoke. His voice, when he said her name, was barely above a whisper. But it was clear. Every word was clear. He said her name and he said her mother's name and he said the old words, and somewhere in the middle of the witnessing his voice did the thing that very old voices do when they are finally allowed to carry what they have been holding, which is that it broke, very slightly, once, and then it steadied, and he finished. He lifted his thumb. The fire crackled and settled. Scarith looked at Mara. "It is done," he said. "Under dragon law, old law, the law that was here before the borders and the treaties and the wars, you carry a complete mark. You are kin to any warrior who fought beside Drentha of the Ember Crest. You are not without name. You are not without house." He paused. "You have not been without them since the morning your mother put her hand in fire. But now it is recorded. Now it is real in the way the law requires it to be real." Mara stood with her arms still extended and her eyes on the fire. She lowered her arms slowly. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have fit inside the moment without making it smaller, and she seemed to understand that, and so she stood in the quiet and let it be what it was. Scarith and Valindra moved toward the door. Bryn Cole was the last to go. He stopped in the doorway and turned back once and looked at Mara standing alone in the firelight of the empty tavern, small and still, with her left hand pressed to her right palm the way her mother had once pressed a child's hand against burning skin. He folded his wing. It was a slow and deliberate movement, the great dark wing drawing forward and down in the old salute, the one that had no translation in any human language because humans had no equivalent gesture, the one given only to those who were family in the truest sense of that word. He held it for a moment. Then he turned and walked out into the dark. Mara stood alone. Outside she could hear the wind and the slow sound of 3 old dragons moving away down the road. She stood without moving for a long time with her hand on her wrist and the fire at her back and 20 years of something unfinished finally, completely, done.